This episode of Game Master's Journey is brought to you by the patrons and other supporters of Starwalker Studios. Find out more about becoming a patron, as well as all the other great ways you can support the show at starwalkerstudios.com/support. Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 193 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produced this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I've got a great interview for you today. Martin Hérbert is joining me on the show. Martin is a professor of anthropology, and we're going to talk about how anthropology can help us create more realistic and more interesting cultures and worlds for our RPGs. We'll discuss some of the common mistakes made by world builders, and we'll tell you how you can avoid making those mistakes yourself. So here we are in December of 2017, and Game Master's Journey is quickly approaching its 3rd year anniversary, which blows my mind. Now, a lot has changed since I started this show 3 years ago and 193 episodes ago. My love for RPGs and the art of game mastering hasn't changed. But one thing that has changed is the numerous other demands on my time. As time goes on, it becomes more and more challenging to find the time to produce this show and to maintain the level of quality that you've come to expect from Starwalker Studios podcasts. So as we near the end of season 11 of the show, I'd like to once again remind you that the success and continuation of this podcast depends on you. It depends on your support. I say it in every episode, and it's true. Without the support of the patrons and other listeners of this show, the show would not be possible. So, if you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to keep getting new content, I urge you to support the show. The best way to do so is to become a patron. You can choose your level of support, and there are even some cool perks you can get as a patron. If you can't afford to support the show monetarily, another great way you can help me out is to use my Amazon referral link. You can bookmark that link and then use it whenever you shop on Amazon, and when you do so, I'll get a small kickback. You can find my Amazon referral link and the link to my Patreon page at starwalkerstudios.com/support. That page has other great ways you can support the show as well. Speaking of great ways to support the show, you can also purchase Game Master's Journey t-shirts and my D&D adventure module, The Trickster's Labyrinth, on the website. So head on over to starwalkerstudios.com/support and do your part to ensure the future of Game Master's Journey. And just as an addendum to my little spiel here, you know, I got to say, every once in a blue moon, I'll get a complaint from a listener that I talk about the Patreon too much or something like that. Thankfully, not very often that I get those complaints. And it's amazing to me because I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and it amazes me how many podcasts are just loaded with advertisements or who go on and on about their Patreons and and all the various ways that you can support their shows and things like that. And in the average episode of Game Master's Journey, my discussion of ways to support the show and the Patreon and all that stuff is, in most episodes, 2 minutes or less. I have a little sort of ad I run in the middle of the show that's under a minute long, and then I usually mention it here and there briefly at the beginning and the end of the show. So, and also this show tends to be close to 2 hours long most weeks, always over an hour almost. So 2 minutes out of that much is not bad at all. You think about if you watch a show on TV, how many commercials there are. If you listen to the radio, how many commercials there are, or even a lot of podcasts, how many commercials there are. And you don't get that with Game Master's Journey. So I actually think I don't do enough of promoting the Patreon and all the other great ways that you can support the show on the show. So that's something I'll try to do more of as I said, it becomes increasingly difficult to find the time to put into the show that I think it deserves. And I want to keep doing Game Master's Journey for another 3 years, for another 11 seasons. But I can't do it without your help. So do your part today, and I'll keep doing my part and producing a great podcast for you. All right. So we are going to move on to the main part of the show today, my discussion with Martin about all the great ways that anthropology can help you build a much more compelling, interesting, and realistic world for your RPG. Martin is joining me on the show today, and Martin is a professor of anthropology, and we're going to talk today about how anthropology can improve your world building and make your game more interesting. So welcome to the show, Martin.
Well, thanks for having me, Lex.
Well, thanks for coming on. Maybe you can start out and just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are in the world and all that good stuff.
Yes, well, I'm, as you said, a professor of anthropology at the Université Laval in Quebec City, Laval University in English. I focus on social anthropology, so as we'll probably get to talk a little bit more later on, anthropology is quite a big field with many, many sub-fields and everything, but my specialty is basically living populations, living societies and cultures. More specifically, I'm in the field that you call political anthropology. So basically power relations between people, how people try to shape their world and shape their institutions and everything. I've been doing field work in Mexico and Guatemala for 20 years now.
Oh, wow.
Working with Mayan people over there and other groups also in central Mexico.
Awesome.
Yeah. I have to say, I really enjoy your podcast. I've been listening for a few months now and really enjoy it.
Oh, that's great. I'm really happy to hear that, especially from an anthropology professor. You probably know all the times I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, but what I enjoy is the focus on the mechanics and the rules, and because really that's, in a sense, what anthropology is about, trying to find ways of representing complex worlds and societies. And I really like the emphasis you put on that also, saying, basically you're looking for the best way to simulate and reproduce these complex experiences. So that's great.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about this today because I think that there's a lot that can be done from the kind of anthropology perspective as far as doing more than the kind of European focused fantasy that we see so much, doing different things. So I'm excited.
Yeah, well, that's the fun in it too. I really look forward to exploring that and seeing what anthropology can contribute to RPGs and world building, and making things a little bit more original.
Yeah. So can you tell us just a little bit more for anyone listening who may not be sure, what is anthropology and what are some of the different kind of subfields of anthropology?
Yes, well, people would be in their right, certainly, to be confused about what is anthropology, because most anthropologists do not agree on what it is exactly. So, but basically, the complication comes from the fact that anthropology studies basically anything that is human and human related in the present, in the past, and across the world. So, as you see, it's very broad, but in a sense, it's also very narrow in that anthropology's main goal is to compare different ways of being and of living, mostly among humans, but also there's a huge part of anthropology that's concerned with primates, for example.
Okay.
Always with the goal of comparing who we are with who our cousins are, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
So you have large parts of anthropology that deal with, for instance, the very distant past, the further fossils that can be linked to the human family tree. Some anthropologists compare societies and that are living today. Others are what they call ethno-historians. So basically, midway, you have archaeologists. Um, think about it like medicine in a way. So medicine is this broad field, and you have all these all these specialities within it. And in the end, they all work to sort of the understanding of one thing, which is how humans live in the world, basically.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, anthropology has a huge umbrella with a lot of things underneath it.
Yeah.
And one thing I think for GMs out there, one thing that's nice about anthropology as opposed to, for instance, history, which probably a lot of GMs already study, is that you learn about a lot more cultures than what you traditionally learn about in a lot of history classes and whatnot, because we're not just focusing on European cultures and history.
Yes, absolutely. This was actually a very traditional way of splitting, we would say, the workload of studying human civilizations,
Okay.
which is history used to focus on civilizations and societies with a written culture. So
Okay.
ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Egyptians, and whatnot. So whatever culture had texts were basically within the purview of history, and anthropology used to deal almost exclusively with one non literary societies, so societies that do not use written languages but rather rely on oral traditions. So yeah, that was one of the historic split between the two, but now of course it's a little bit muddier,
Yeah.
but yeah, basically. So yes, it does expand our way, the number and the diversity of cultures and society that we can look at, but more importantly, it brings to the fore other ways of transmitting society and culture. And if we're talking about GMs and sort of how this can relate to RPGs, we could point out that one of the defining characteristics of anthropology is what we would call its holistic perspective. So anthropology looks for links between different aspects of a society. So think of any 2, 3, 4 aspects of a culture or society: religion, language, economy, politics, kinship, whatnot. Instead of studying them in isolation, anthropology looks for bridges and intersections between these aspects. So if you imagine the description of a typical setting in an RPG, you would have a chapter on geography and a chapter on the economy and a chapter on history and a chapter on warfare or whatnot. And what anthropology would try to do is basically see how each of these relates with the others. So it's really about the integration of these many dimensions of what a society is.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because if you're a GM doing world building, it's a really useful thing to think about. Like say you start with the history of a certain area, and then you start thinking about, well, how's that going to impact the religion? How's that going to impact the art? How is the relationship between this group and neighboring groups going to impact the food that they eat and the clothes that they wear and just all kinds of things are all interconnected.
Absolutely. And when you're doing that, you're doing the comparative work of an anthropologist. This is our bread and butter, really. Trying to understand the connections and to understand that everything is not of one block either. It's not sort of, you often see that in some world building in fantasy. For example, Tolkien is very notorious for that, where everything is so coherent that there's no space for transformation, basically. So the elves have a language that is very airy, and that's in line with their immortality, or almost, and so all the aspects are sort of hyper coherent, and of course this is not the way that normal societies and culture exists, but yeah, that's sort of pushing this kind of integration a little further than it has to. But anthropology is trying to basically negotiate the fact that there is a coherence, there is some interaction between all these aspects, but there's also some wiggle room for, change and conflict and transformation of societies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of, we're now into one of the main things we wanted to talk about today, which is we both believe that anthropology can be an awesome resource when it comes to world building and creating a setting that's not only makes sense when the players start picking at it, but also is a little more unique than a lot of what we see in fantasy. So what are some ways that we can use anthropology in our world building?
Yeah, well, if you allow me, maybe we could look at some of the mistakes, some of the ways of not doing it. And
okay, sure.
My inspiration for that actually is a text that was published in White Dwarf magazine. You probably know about it. It's a classic of dungeon building. It's called The Dungeon Architect.
Okay.
And in that text, the author was called Roger Musson. I will not summarize the text, but the opening line is perfect. The first sentence is, "Have you ever wondered how to design a boring dungeon?" And we could apply that exactly to our discussion today about, have you ever wondered how to design a boring world? And then he goes on to explain some of the mistakes that are usually made, and we can learn a lot from these mistakes. So maybe I could list a few, and it will, I think, bring to the fore things that can be done.
Okay.
But of course, the goal here is not to act as a police of world building. Anthropology, RPGs and fantasy, one of the important goal is to have fun and to make it interesting.
Right.
But so anthropology is not there to sort of chastise and people. But when the goal is to create something original, as you said, and something sort of a little bit different, it's good to have a little perspective. And I think we could have a few elements here. So I've already mentioned one. The first one I've mentioned is this hypercoherence. And as I said, Tolkien is really the one of the main culprit for bringing that into fantasy. He was so obsessed with building a world where everything would mesh together very tightly that he actually created a lot of unidimensional societies. So you have Rohan with the people of the horses, and you have the Shire with the hobbits who basically are characterized by their love of life and food and drink, and you have the elves and the orcs. And so one of the first thing that one should look out for is this sort of abuse of coherence between all the elements of culture. I mean, cultures are products of history. They have a lot of contradictions. They have a lot of inner conflicts, and it's good to use that as storytelling devices. So maybe one could think about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think one thing that is ignoring is cultural diffusion, which is the idea that cultures influence the other cultures nearby that they trade and interact with. And so you'd think there'd be, for instance, elements of Elven culture that remind you of Dwarven culture because they've interacted in the past or something like that.
Absolutely. We could only look at the borders between these groups. Usually, the device when one is mapping a fantasy world is to put this big chain of mountain between groups or an
Yeah.
ocean or
Yeah.
whatever. Does it put some sort of barrier? But usually, groups are in contact, and of course, they exchange things, material, culture, artifacts. They exchange parts of languages. I'm not aware that Tolkien ever introduces a borrowed word in one language from another. The
Oh
elves
yeah.
have their elven language, and the dwarves have their dwarven language, and yeah, not one word has spread to the other languages. That's really interesting when you look at it from a human perspective. Our languages are completely the opposite. They're all sort of patchworks of multiple influences.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, well, anthropology helps to see that.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh, okay, so yeah, and so we could move to another one.
Sure.
Um, to my knowledge, there is only one book that really um, makes explicitly the bridge between anthropology and fantasy world building. It's by Laura Milanovic. It's sort of a how could you say that a workbook for probably workshops that she gave or something. And it's actually called Cultural Anthropologies for Writer,
Okay.
a world building guide. So it's a small book, but there are some exercises in there for people who are interested. But what I've taken away from that book is that she comes up with one mistake that I actually find very funny, and she names it the Lucas.
Okay.
The Lucas mistake, according to her,
George
is
Lucas, is that
yes,
who she's referring to?
yeah, name in the honor of George Lucas, where you have a whole galaxy, and people can move across that galaxy, and they understand the culture of almost any point of the galaxy. So you have people moving across light years, basically,
Mhm.
and never making an intercultural mistake, never so not understanding what is going on around them.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that was a very interesting observation that I found. And of course, even in our own society, we always run into these problems of misunderstandings and sort of not really understanding what the game is about and what the norms are and what one should be doing or not. Or so in our world, we always negotiate uh, these challenges. And of course, in the world of Star Wars, you sort of have this common, basic cultural understanding that there are things you do and things you do not, even though if the settings are very different and the geography and the ecology of planets is dramatically different, but everybody sort of figures out what I'm not even talking about differences of languages, but everybody figures out very rapidly what they should be doing in a given setting.
Yeah.
And that's taking away a lot of storytelling potential because misunderstanding is the source of a lot of adventures, whether one likes it or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big thing in science fiction overall is making alien cultures way too human.
Yes, because well, the story has to move forward, and you don't want to spend an hour out of a movie to sort of figure out how what the person in front of you wants to you to act and things like that. But there is some potential in there. Sort of
Yeah.
moving it around in a world where you don't understand what people around you are saying, and you have to rely on other resources to try to work your way through an adventure or a setting or to a city or whatever. So that would be something to try. An entire game where you all you have is sort of cryptic language that you don't understand, and you have to sort of figure out what's going on and who wants what out of you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think even in fantasy games, I think a lot of that is sidestepped by the idea of the common tongue. And anywhere you go in the world, people all speak this one like trade language. And we were talking in email about the Hidden Shrine of Tamawakan. And one thing I thought was kind of cool about that adventure was there was this ancient language that most likely none of the player characters spoke. And how do you deal with this fact where all of a sudden we can't read all the writings in this temple and we don't know what's going on? And it was then that I realized how seldom I've seen that happen in D&D, because we always have this language that everybody speaks.
Yes, that's an interesting thing, because of course there are some instances, a lot of instances in the human world of these common tongues. But what they do have in common is that they usually apply to a very narrow spectrum of realities.
Okay.
So they apply to trade
Right.
more often than not, or to science, specific aspect of society. But when you get into intimate relationships, sort of friendship, and the level of expressing emotions or things like that, these common tongues are very limited. And in fantasy settings, they're used as a natural tongue. They're used as a natural language that expresses the whole breadth of what human languages are supposed to express. So that's a shortcut there that should really be examined. For instance, there are some linguists who are talking today about English as the language of globalization. So one of the main language of trade and main language of science around the world is English. But real linguists, real specialists of the English language itself point out that it's a very limited form of English. And they've actually begun to call it the globish, global English, because it's sort of a English in a narrow bandwidth, because it doesn't have all the subtleties that sort of a native speaker would bring to English in relations of within the family or within intimate friends or whatever. So even in that case, they make a distinction saying, globish has a very poor vocabulary, as some very limited forms of expressions, because it's applied to trade, business, science, and, well, specific aspects of society.
Right.
So that could be something to play on. So saying, when you're in a business relationship, the common tongue is really helpful. But when you start to enter in a conflict where there's a lot of possibilities for misunderstanding, you see the limits of that common tongue.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in a way, I think like a GM could approach that is, let's say your players have gone to a town or something in an area very far from where they're used to, is the people there could still speak common. And like you said, when it comes to trade or getting a room, things like that, it's fairly easy to do. But as soon as you try to talk about more than that, you find out, they have a lot of local words for things we don't understand. They have their own slang and ways of talking that's very different than what we're used to. And it's like, even though we can understand a lot of the words we're saying, there's still a lot that's kind of hidden that we have to figure out, like a mystery to solve.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very interesting middle ground between having sort of a complete understanding of what's going on and sort of this cluelessness that the tourists, the fish out of the water would have.
Yeah, and there's so much great story potential there too that you could have some fun with, misunderstandings and whatnot.
Yes. I mean, you could imagine a whole quest where people sort of launch into this adventure, based on a misunderstanding. They thought that they were going after uh, I don't know, some very precious treasure, and in the end, it's just there's this. I think that it's an Eddie Murphy movie where the treasure is actually a kid. They think it's something. I don't remember. Tibet, the Prince of Tibet, or something like that. And
Okay.
all the way through the movie, he thinks it's this sort of a magical item or very sort of precious treasure, and it turns out that he's actually going to rescue a kid, and he has to deal with sort of a realignment there of what's actually going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, another one we could look at. It actually comes from that little article, "The Dungeon Architect," I was referring to earlier, and
Okay.
it's what Roger Musson calls the zoo, and it was actually a very interesting metaphor because one of the biggest mistake you can make in building a dungeon is that you actually create a series of rooms, and each room has sort of a monster or a treasure, and everything is just there, static, and waiting for the PCs.
I've done that.
So,
I'll raise my hand.
so, so nothing goes on in the world until
Right.
the central characters walk in, and then everything sort of pops into life. And of course, no world is built like that.
Right.
Uh, so you have to imagine that things are still going on when the PCs are out of the room or out of the city or out of the country. And when they come back to it, it has actually changed. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, you leave your hometown for 6 months or a year, and you come back, and some pretty significant things might have changed.
Right. Yeah.
So that was a nice application from the dungeon up to the world. But yeah, that's a one I really liked because anthropologists are like that too. You have some specialists of a given culture, and it might be a very remote culture that lives in the center of Amazonia. The anthropologist cannot be there all the time, so he or she goes there for 6 months and then comes back and talk about what went on there
Right.
for years and years, and then goes back and realize that it, this little community has nothing to do with what he has been talking about because he's been describing sort of the community of 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we are not the center of the world. Things continue to change. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, that was an interesting one. Another one, and here I think we're really touching something that's at the heart of sort of the dialogue that anthropology can have with RPG and fantasy literature and science fiction. It's really about the exotic. I don't have to remind your listeners that classic science fiction from the 19th century, beginning early 20th century, was extremely heavy on colonialism and imperialism, and you had this view
Yeah.
of the world sort of, I'm going to discover the natives, and and everything was very. Uh, let's put it this way: the topics of interest were usually the most spectacular and exotic practices within the society,
Uh-huh.
to the point where you have basically texts that were written by travelers and explorers that of which you don't know if it's fantasy or if it's anthropology. And I remember this title of a book, which was called "My Journey Among the Headhunters," my journey among sort of the head shrinkers, and I mean, you have a whole series of that.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to learn. Well, other than I mean, societies are more than these practices. I think there's something very practical to learn for world building. That is, um, I would call it the mistake of front loading the exotic. That is putting right away, right up front, sort of the most different practice that the society you are describing has. So the typical sort of narrative around that would be you have PCs walking into a village, and there in the middle of the village, they see a site for a shrine for human sacrifice, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So right off the bat, you have this sort of very dramatic, very spectacular aspect of a society you are describing. But what you are doing is that you are sort of skewing towards the dramatic, every other detail, every other aspect of that society that you'll be discussing later on. So if you're talking about a human sacrifice, for example, well, there's nothing you can learn after that that will top such a spectacular event.
Right.
And so you will sort of slide in a sort of either an escalation where it has to become always sort of a more and more dramatic and spectacular and exotic, or you'll sort of have blown your one sort of big bang, and then afterwards it's just, well, okay, now let's try to figure out who these guys are. And you've just killed any sort of a momentum towards understanding of any kind after that. So yeah, there is something to think about in that kind of front loading.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, it's sort of easing into it, sort of starting with sort of understanding a society, understanding a culture, and sort of working your way towards sort of the more exotic and difficult practices to understand.
Yeah. So maybe start out, you enter the village and things seem pretty normal. Maybe the clothes are a little different than what you're used to. The building architecture is a little bit different, but make the player characters actually talk to people and get to know people before they start to realize, oh, there's some really strange things going on here, instead of just hitting them with it right away.
Yes, absolutely. And it does shift the kind of action that can take place because, as I said, the typical colonial narrative would be, well, we walked into the village, we saw human sacrifice, and then the only thing we could do was sort of wipe everybody out because it was sort of, a bunch of barbarians or whatever.
Right.
There's an author, actually, Orson Scott Card.
Oh, yeah.
He's played wonderfully into that aspect. I don't know if you've read Speaker for the Dead. It's the second book in the Ender sort of a cycle there.
Okay.
And the whole book, actually, and I think it has something like 600 pages or something, is precisely an answer to that literature I was talking about. So at the beginning of the book, you have this sort of very exotic species, which he calls the piggies. They're called the piggies because they resemble little pigs.
Okay.
And in the opening of the book, they commit this gruesome murder of two humans. And of course, everybody wants to wipe the piggies out, and they can't understand how a species could commit such atrocities. And then Ender, the central character, and a few others enter into this journey of trying to understand what's going on. Why did they do that? They were friendly to start with, and then they turn sort of psychopath, or I don't know what. And then and it's a whole journey of trying to understand, not to justify what the piggies have been doing, but understand from within the kind of the world they inhabit and the meaning that this has. And sort of the general topic is, sometimes you do come across cultures that are very distant and very different, and you have to sort of negotiate that complexity. We would say.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I know that one thing I love to do as a game master, and I know a lot of other GMs really like this too, is playing with player assumptions and preconceptions, and kind of using those to almost against the players to surprise them. So it seems like you could do something like that with this, where they encounter a new culture they've never encountered before. And maybe they see something like that, like a sacrifice or something that seems on the surface very barbaric and leads to the players making snap judgments about what's going on. But then as they investigate, they find out that there's actually something very different going on, and that their initial kind of snap judgment of what they thought was happening is completely wrong. And maybe the people they think are the bad guys are actually the good guys, and vice versa. Or maybe there is no bad guys or good guys.
Yes, well, that's another aspect to it that is sort of getting to understand that sometimes people are just different. Not better, not worse, just in a whole different logic. And I think in fantasy settings, this is something that can certainly be explored. In real life, it's a bit more difficult to negotiate that because, I mean, everybody needs to have a moral compass, and you cannot sort of float into this relativism.
Right.
But in a fantasy setting, this is something that actually, yes, could certainly be explored, and there's a lot of potential for stories in there. So, as you said, sort of exploring one's assumptions, and maybe not with something as dramatic as sacrifice, but there are plenty of practices that, I mean, could work in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Even down to what people eat. You know, there's so many examples of types of food that in one culture people would say, "Oh, I would never eat that," and in another culture they really enjoy it, and it's completely a cultural thing. There's not a right or wrong to it. It's just how you're raised and how you think.
Absolutely, and I'm a Canadian, and I've spent a few Thanksgiving in the U.S., and people were shocked when I said to them that, well, in my part of the world, we don't eat pumpkin. Pumpkin usually, well, traditionally was pig food. And, the idea of a pumpkin pie is very alien to to me. Now, of course, borders have opened up and everything, but traditionally, in French Canada, eating pumpkin is something that's really strange. So yeah, it could be as homely as pumpkin pie, but yes.
Well, another example, I know in places in South America, guinea pigs were a food staple. And here in America, people would never think of eating a guinea pig.
Absolutely, yes. And when I tell my American friends that we eat horse meat, they're appalled. Yeah, so yeah, you don't have to go very far. So imagine in a setting where, I mean, cultures and societies are dramatically different one from another. I mean, the potential is quite great. And of course, with food comes a whole lot of rituals, social relationships. In many parts of the world, eating what people offer you is a way of accepting friendships and everything. So sometimes the stakes are very high. So you get invited by a family, and they offer you something to eat, and for them it's sort of the meal of princes, and for you it's I mean, you just can't eat it, and it puts you in a very awkward situation, up to the point where there can actually be a conflict that arises out of it.
Right. You know, this reminds me of a story one of my anthropology professors told me when I was in school. He was talking about, he was, I can't remember, somewhere in Peru. I can't remember which group of people he was with, but I believe it was Peru. But they have an alcoholic beverage they make called chicha. Mm-hmm. And it's like in a lot of cultures, the alcoholic beverage is a very important part of their culture. It's not just something, you know, there's more to it than just something you drink. It has cultural significance. And so he's with these people, and all the people are sitting around, passing around a container of this chicha to share a drink. and it's a very ritualized thing. It's a very important thing. And as the guest, he gets the first sip, and he'd never had it before. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he didn't want to offend his hosts. So he goes to take a sip of this drink and he sees maggots floating around in it. And he's like, oh, this is so disgusting, but I don't want to offend anybody. So he takes a sip, does his best to keep any of the maggots from getting in his mouth, passes it to the next guy. And this guy's basically saying, oh, why did you drink this? There's maggots in it. This is no good.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, when you don't know the codes, yes, you don't know what's normal.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I have to say, from my own field work, there are just times where even though you really want to, you can't. For me, that was with iguana. I would serve a bowl of iguana. You could see the paw and everything. And I knew that I had to eat some, but I was paralyzed, literally. My hand could not lift and take that piece of meat and put it to my mouth. It was just impossible. So so you can understand that in a context where diplomacy is involved, or you have to ask a favor of a very important character or whatever, this could become a problem very quickly.
Yeah.
This is Mike Shalai, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to take a minute to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. It's because of the patrons that all the listeners of Game Master's Journey enjoy a bonus episode every month, as well as the monthly Game Master's Journey live stream. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Steve. Let's hear it for Steve.
Yeah.
Yes.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. I know one of the first concepts they taught us in anthropology was the idea of ethnocentrism, which is basically people tend to think that the way their culture does it is the right or the best way, and tend to judge negatively cultures that are different. And I think this is something you can really use where, your player characters are going to do the same thing. So if they see something strange in a culture that's very different, they're going to tend to assume that the way they do it is right. And so that's kind of a player assumption you can count on, and you could play with that and kind of flip the tables, and maybe they find out that, there's really good reasons that they do things this particular way.
Absolutely. And there is an even a broader way of using these assumptions is that, of course, in our enlightened times, people have learned to recognize the fact that if you judge negatively other cultures and societies, you might pass as a racist. So ethnocentrism is often understood as judging yourself above others.
Right.
But actually, the concept itself is broader than that, and basically means judging all other cultures according to your standards. So that includes cultures that you think are somewhat better than you in some way or another. So, for instance, you have this idea of some cultures being more spiritual or more ecological, closer to nature, wiser in some ways. This is ethnocentrism too. So your player characters are stuck in the middle of these two types of judgments. So, and this is a way of creating very interesting situation, because often with the goal of showing that they have an open mind, or they want to reach across differences. They will sort of go overboard in the other way and say, I'll take all the wisdom of this old man because he seems so spiritual and he seems so connected with everything around him.
Yeah.
You can instantly think of Avatar by James Cameron.
Sure.
It is extremely ethnocentric as a world building strategy. What he does, it's not race. Well, it's not race. It's a form of racism, basically, which we call sort of the ecological other. So the other cannot make a mistake. The other cannot be out of touch with his spirituality or out of touch with nature, and the other becomes sort of the defender of all that's good in the world. And of course, things are always more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And the way of sort of moving out of that sort of situation is basically to recognize difference, and a difference that cannot be judged along your own scales of values.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a lot harder to do. Instead of saying, well, they are wiser than we are, or they are more ecological, you can say, well, they have a different relation with nature, and they have a different relation with the world that we cannot see around us, or whatever. And that really gets your gears cranking, because it's a lot harder to imagine that than to say, I'll imagine this sort of flawless people, or this sort of ideal people, or the sort of absolute reverse of that, sort of these absolutely evil orcs that are nothing but bad. And
right.
So you need to think sort of laterally instead of up and down there. That's quite a challenge.
That's a really good point, because I think a lot of us are probably aware of judging another culture as, quote, bad, like your orc example, but going the other way I don't think is as obvious. And when you were talking about it, it really made me think of the elves from Tolkien, and how it just seems like everything in elven culture is just better. Yeah. They're just better than humans in any conceivable way.
Yes. And that's not understanding elven culture.
Right.
It's actually judging ourselves against that idealized. And that's very much what Tolkien was doing with the hobbits, with the elves, sort of creating these archetypes of good societies and good people, and using them. And that's the key word here. They're just devices to judge our own society and our own culture.
Right.
And by doing that, this is ethnocentrism. It's not racist in the sense of sort of pejorative way, but it's certainly negating negating the complexity of these people and these cultures.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and of course, as the readership and diversity of players in RPG increases, this sort of a non-problematic center that judges everyone better or worse becomes a problem in itself. Because, of course, in the 19th century, when Jules Verne was writing his fantastic voyages of people going around the world and sort of passing judgment on everybody and anybody, his readership was very small. I mean, there were basically people who were all alike. They were well-off Europeans, white, male, often. But as the readership diversifies, these judgments are less and less solid in a way, because people don't share the same assumptions about what should be going on in a given society. So it creates an incentive to reserve judgment and to bring complexity where people have faults, people have qualities, and in different doses and different compositions, but societies are complex things.
Yeah. And I think one of our goals in I think both fantasy and science fiction really is to present things that are fantastic and different, and to experience new things. And as a GM, whatever kind of game you're running, a great way to do that and to show your players something maybe they haven't seen before is to branch out of these common assumptions that so much of our art and things like that makes in our cultures.
Yeah, and that leads you into original production. That leads you into sort of really the realm of creation, rather than just sort of reproducing sort of narratives that are already there and already sort of have been used for generations and generations. The bad industrial society against the good rural simple life, and things like that, the spiritual against the material, and all these oppositions that are extremely rooted in Western traditions, that have been exploited again and again in these narratives.
Yeah.
I have another one.
Okay.
And that was quite an interesting cultural translation exercise for me. There is a very common saying in French that I was trying to translate in English, and I found the translation, which is very obscure, I think, for English speakers, but I will explain it. So the mistake I'm referring to could be called Charlie's dead. Charlie's dead.
Okay.
It's actually an old British saying that people use to remind, very politely, to remind women that the petticoat they were wearing was showing below the hem of their skirt. So in French, the saying is "le jupon dépasse." So basically, what that means is that something that you were trying to hide is actually showing very much, and everybody sees it. So yeah, so I won't go into why it's called Charlie's dead in English. It has to do with the death of King Charles, and women were protesting against that by showing the hem of their petticoat below their skirt, and people would just put a hand on their shoulder saying, Charlie's dead now, so you can hide that petticoat. And actually what I'm referring to here is settings where the influences are way too obvious. So to the point of plagiarism, basically.
Okay.
So this could relate to real societies. I think one form of very lazy world building is to just lift cultural traits from an existing society and just put a little makeup on them and rename them, and just,
this is feudal Japan.
yeah. But it's not Japan. It's just another planet.
Right. It just happens to be just like feudal Japan.
Yes. Or sort of a Buddhist temple or whatever. And so, and of course, looking a little bit into that in forums and everything, I realized that some people were actually quite proud of that. They were proud, especially when they lifted things from existing fictional worlds, saying, I built all my world, and in the end, I realized that it looks very much like Warhammer. And the person would just go on and say, I'm proud of that. I'm proud that, I'm creating something in that universe.
Okay.
So it's not a mistake in itself, but it really draws the attention to the difference between fan fiction and actually world building.
Yeah.
In some cases, fan fiction is what people are after. The problem is when you're doing one and thinking you're doing the other. When you think you're world building and creating something that's really original and novel and everything, but basically just lifting elements here and there from Tolkien, from Warhammer or Dungeons and Dragon or whatever. So yeah, that's something to think about, I think, and really be aware when your petticoat is showing, and be sure that you control that. That's actually something that you want in your world. Sort of this wink, wink reference to something that's already out there.
Yeah. It's funny. I grew up in Indiana, which is in the Midwest here in the United States. And we had a very similar saying. Our saying was your barn door's open, which meant that your fly was down.
Yeah.
You're letting all the cows out. That's what people would say.
Well, that's very much the same idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, it looks a bit sad when you're presenting your world as something that's really your creation, and
right.
People can see that, the barn doors all open all the way.
Yeah, that's great. Were there any other common mistakes that you've seen that you wanted to go over today?
Yeah, well, I would have a last one, and maybe a sort of a last word of wisdom, or
okay.
We were talking about the parallel between ethnography and world building, and I think one thing to keep in mind is that the ethnographer, when you're talking about a fantasy world, is the player, it's the reader. It's not the GM, and it's not the author, because world building lends itself to information dumps in massive ways. So instead of sort of handing out massive sort of bunch of information about here's the economy of that world that I will explain to you through and through, and with all the cosmology and everything, there has, I think, to be some space for the players to find things out for themselves, to discover the world bit by bit and make sense of what they find, instead of sort of having all this compendium dumped into them. There's this idea that only the GM should know the rules. Well, I think it applies also to world building. Only the GM should sort of master every aspect, or master the deep history, and sort of give it bit by bit to players.
Yeah,
that brings a little more fun to the exercise there.
Yeah, I completely agree. Always be on the lookout for an opportunity to show the players an aspect of your world that's interesting, but in a time and place that it's relevant, instead of just, here, let me tell you all about everything.
Yeah. How many times have you seen this idea that, players walk into a room and it's a library containing massive tomes explaining the history of the world, or they drop by this elder person who will sort of tell all the tales about what has been going on since the dawn of times, and parcel the information out and just give it bit by bit, and people will have the impression of finding it out by themselves, and they'll have an opportunity to sort of stitch things together and bring their interpretation to the work.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
Yeah, well, that was sort of a few of the mistakes / sort of a path that we could explore to bridge what anthropology has been finding out the hard way for a century and a half now, and put that to benefit in RPGs.
Yeah, and it's just really interesting stuff too. If you start digging into anthropology and learning about cultures that you've never learned about, it's really interesting.
Yes, it is, and it's an invitation to dig deep into these cultures, not just to take sort of what's on the surface and what's the most obvious, but really try to sort of dig a few layers deeper and try to understand something basic that's going on, not just saying, they have this funny dance and I want to put that in my game, and try to understand what's different about that dance, what's the move, sort of the logic behind it, and sort of dig and then what you'll put in the game will probably be quite different and quite an interpretation of that cultural practice, but it will be sort of a part of a process of trying to figure things out and understand sort of the diversity of what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the listener who finds this really interesting, do you have any suggestions for places to go learn more and get more information?
Yeah, well, actually, there are. Well, I've published 2 little texts on the topic on
Okay.
anthropologygeek.com. The Geek Anthropologist, sorry. It's thegeekanthropologist.com. And it's a website dedicated to basically exploring the border between anthropology and popular culture. So there are some reflections on movies, TV shows, a little bit about RPG, but that could certainly grow in coming years, I think.
Awesome.
That would be something to check out.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah. And of course, if you're looking for raw inspiration, I've been rediscovering lately a data bank that's called the Human Relations Area Files. It's sort of a very old anthropological project that's fallen a little bit by the wayside because people were saying, well, it's a bit of an oversimplification, and it's sort of takes a number of, well, I think they're up to almost 2,000 descriptions of societies, and they sort of parcel it out in topics, kinship, economy, and the like. But
Oh, wow.
I find that it's super interesting for fantasy worlds because it really sort of goes topic by topic. It's divided. So if you want to have an idea about, I don't know, how are children raised in a variety of societies? Well, they have a topic for that. So I would suggest that your listeners look at a document that's called Outline of Cultures Materials, OCM, Outline of Cultural Materials, and you will find the index of all the 400 or so categories of what could be described within a society. And it really tells you, well, it shows you how much fantasy settings are focused on one or two aspects of these societies. And there's a whole universe there of topics that can still be explored.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely link to those sites in the show notes.
Oh, great.
So you
great.
guys can find them super easy.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
that's great.
That's awesome, Martin. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us today.
Well, it was a lot of fun.
I feel like we barely scratched the surface. We said so much, and yet there's so much more that could be said, I feel like.
Absolutely. We could look at specific examples of how people have gone and inspired themselves from anthropological work to build fantasy worlds. We could look at Frank Herbert's Dune, for example. It was a very classic case of using some anthropological literature and trying to build a world out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you ever want to talk anthropology and RPGs again, definitely let me know, because I feel like we could just go on and on about this forever.
Absolutely. Yes, certainly. I'm willing whenever.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, thanks so much, Martin. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm serious. If there's more you'd like to talk about, I'm definitely game, because I think this will be really useful to people, and it's not something else I really hear anyone else talking about. So,
well, let's go for it then.
All right. Well, that is going to wrap it up for episode 193 of Game Master's Journey. I want to once again thank Martin so much for joining me on the show. I really, really enjoyed our conversation today. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. And I hope no one felt insulted by by my asking Martin to explain what anthropology is, but I myself had never heard the word anthropology and certainly didn't know what it was until I took an intro course at university of anthropology. And so I don't think it's insane to think that there might be some of you listening that weren't sure what anthropology was. I hope that you see now how this is an invaluable field for game masters and world builders, whatever you're world building for, whether it's for a game or something you're writing or whatever you're doing. Anthropology is a fantastic resource. I know a lot of GMs study history and use history as inspiration for their games, but history is really just showing you a very, very small part of a very, very large picture. It's very limited as far as the amount of time that it covers, and it's also very limited in the number and types of cultures that it covers and the depth in which it covers them. So, if you haven't done any digging into anthropology, I really encourage you to do so. If you head on over to the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com, I'll have all the various resources Martin and I discussed linked there for you. And beyond that, as far as my recommendation, if you want to learn more about anthropology, where to get started, is just find yourself a good book on cultural anthropology. A good introductory textbook would be ideal, and that'll get you started. And another great place to go is to read some ethnographies about various cultures and learn about some cultures you've never heard of that are very different than the cultures you have heard of and learned about. And yeah, there's just so much to learn, and it's so fascinating and so directly relevant for GMs. So I would love to hear from you what you thought about today's episode, and I definitely plan to have Martin back on the show. So if you have any questions for Martin, I'd love to hear those from you as well, and I can throw those at him next time he comes and joins me on the show. So you can reach me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. You can also call the Game Masters Journey voicemail number, and you can leave me a message and talk to me. If your question or your feedback is entertaining or enlightening, or better yet, both, you might even hear that message on the show. So that phone number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future topics, I'd love to hear from you. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes of Game Masters Journey at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey, as well as links to connect with the Game Masters Journey community on Google Plus and Discord, where you can share ideas, questions, and stories with other listener GMs. And finally, if you would like to support Game Masters Journey and Star Walker Studios, you can find all the fantastic ways you can do so at starwalkerstudios.com/support. So I want to thank you for tuning in for yet another episode of Game Masters Journey. And please let me know what you thought about this episode and any questions for Martin you have, or any questions for me, or anything at all. I would love to hear from you. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Masters Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Star Walker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Masters Journey.